right. Thank you all. Good to see you. This is way too low, you short people. Okay, so we do have to talk about this being World War III, the early years. That's fine. World War III, if you're not quite aware, if we're going to call it the early years, has been going on for some time. People haven't realized that it's going on for some time, but it's a different kind of world war, or a different kind of war period than what you might expect. Typically, when you think of a war, you think, well, there's this country and there's that country and they're fighting with each other. And in this case, it's actually not quite like that. It is internal to each country. It's almost as though it is a world war of civil wars, where each country itself has been split into various factions and is fighting with itself. Meanwhile, there seems to be one and only one country that is completely exempt from this, which is China, which might be, as we just heard, very instrumental in coordinating that. You'll notice that it's less prominent also in some of China's closest friends, which include Iran and now Russia, quite frighteningly. In those places, you have less of this internal division, but certainly through the Western nations, certainly in the United States, we are a nation, a house, if you will, fully divided at this point. The left and the right, as they're called, simply don't even know how to talk to one another, and that is the result of this unrestricted warfare that the Chinese identified as their tool to get us to this point. Although it's not just, as Trevor will talk about at length, it's not just the CCP that has pulled this off against us. In fact, in some ways, they were late to the game. It is, in fact, that we've had an internal subversion happening within our country for a very long time. So when Frank prepped you by saying I might mention cultural Marxism, I hadn't considered it as part, but now I think I have to work it in since he set me up. But I wanted to give some history and some color to this idea of unrestricted warfare. And like Frank, I hope I can give you some insight into something that's actually useful to do, even though it doesn't necessarily feel like it. And this is, I don't know, I'm still a little overwhelmed from listening to Frank. I don't know how you feel. It's like, wow, I knew it was bad, but Frank talked, and now I know it's worse. So I want to talk about unrestricted warfare in the sense of what are the pieces that we don't understand? Like, if you're on this side and I'm on that side and we have guns, we understand war. If you're shelling me and I'm shelling you back, we have trenches, we understand war. What sometimes, I don't necessarily subscribe to this particular model of organizing what warfare looks like, but what sometimes is described as, second generational, third generational, fourth generational, now we're in fifth generation warfare. This unrestricted warfare specifically is referring to using lots of methods other than, it's not limited to, but other than kinetic warfare. You don't need guns and artillery, and you effectively shouldn't be using them at first. What you use particularly is something called political warfare. We might give it lots of cute names: covert warfare, soft warfare, intelligence warfare. But what it is using political means, in other words, non-bellicose means, in order to affect your enemy's population in ways that you want them to be affected, and in particular to drive them in directions you want them to go. Say perhaps massive internal division so that they have no capacity to defend themselves and they make lots of bad decisions. And we're busy fighting with ourselves so that we can't protect ourselves from an outside enemy. Imagine weakening a structure from the inside while you attack it from the outside. What's going to happen? It collapse, right? You weaken a building from the inside, you put a pressure from the outside, it's going to fall down. You put pressure inside of a corporation, get everybody fighting about some woke issue, racism or homophobia or something inside the company. It's roiling inside, and then you hit it with a gigantic PR campaign from outside, and what happens? It folds. The same thing is happening at the national scale. So this political warfare strategy means using political means in order to weaken your enemy with hostile intent. And that is what we've been subjected to for at least 30 years, unambiguously, probably longer. And according to a report that was filed by the Chinese in the 1990s, the Americans' ability to detect and counter political warfare had become so degraded that it might as well not exist. So we've been being subverted from within and from without even knowing that it's happening, without even the capacity to detect it. It would be as if the enemy had some kind of a weapon they could fire at us that we couldn't even see until after it had gone off, and we didn't even know that we'd been hit by a weapon. Right? Imagine a missile or something that could cause an earthquake, and so, oh my God, there's an earthquake, but it's not even a real earthquake. I'm not saying that that's possible. I'm just saying, imagine it as an analogy. So political warfare, I'm going to talk, I guess, a bit about the history. I want to give you a sense of how it's being done. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of China, of the CCP in particular, and what Mao Zedong specifically developed, how it got implemented in the United States, and how it's being used worldwide, and particularly in the United States now, thanks to our good friend George Soros, who is actually a much more instrumental, but in a strange way, character in this whole story than a lot of people realize. We all seem to know he's a big player, but it's important to understand how he is a big player, especially since he's very visibly at odds with China. If you didn't know, the Chinese government has declared George Soros in the past year and a half, A, an international terrorist, and B, a demon. Literally, that was the word that the Chinese state used for him on Twitter. They said George Soros is a demon. So George and the CCP are not friends. But it's George Soros' method that we're all dealing with, and that the CCP, in fact, is using. So historically speaking, there's been no political warfare operator in history more successful in all likelihood, unless there are those in this time that we're not yet able to document historically, than Mao Zedong. And certainly whoever is that big of a puppet master, so to speak, these days is using methods that were largely derived from the successes of Mao Zedong. And when I say successes, I mean in the most evil sense of the word. He was a very successful tactician in China. This resulted in the deaths of anywhere, the estimates are full of fudge, so anywhere between 50 and 200 million people in China over the course of about 20 years, maybe 30 years. I guess 46 to 76, we could say, is really the 30 years when Mao ruined China. And I'll give you a quotation from 1957, which is a very pivotal time in Mao's regime. He said, "To not have the correct political orientation is like not having a soul." And so this is actually the political warfare mechanism that China developed. I call this the politics of compliance. When we talk about the China model that we were just subjected to through COVID-19, we are now talking about the politics of compliance, which answers the question of how do you get a population to comply with the dictates of a tyrannical government, especially in the situation where you have to use political warfare and you can't use military force. In the 1950s, Mao had the advantage, very simply, of being able to send large numbers of people with guns out to make sure that you did what you were supposed to do. But it turns out that the Chinese Communist Party was able to take over China not because they had superior force over the Nationalist Party, but because they had superior savvy to tear apart civilizations from within and then apply external pressure. And the method is what I'm calling the politics of compliance, has a couple of key pieces. One of those pieces is a division of the population into two essential groups, which are called the people and the enemies of the people in the original Chinese. So you have the people, that's who complies with the tyrannical government. They're the ones who qualify. They have the correct political orientation, so it's like having a soul. And then there are the enemies of the people, who resist the tyrannical government. And in a speech Mao gave at a very pivotal point in 1957, he explains the people, who the people are, changes over time according to what the government needs. At the very beginning, he says, well, who are the people? And who are the enemies of the people? He says, well, during the Sino-Japanese War, in other words, what we call World War II, the part of it that we don't usually pay attention to, where Japan was taking over China very successfully, the Second Sino-Japanese War technically, the enemies of the people were the people who supported the Japanese. But the people were the people who resisted the Japanese. And that seems fairly legitimate given how brutal the Japanese Empire was at the time. But then there was the war between the CCP and the nationalists. And so then the people were the people who supported the CCP and the enemies were the ones who supported the nationalists. And then he says, now we've already taken over. He got power in 1949. This is a speech in 1957, 8 years later. He says, now in this phase of the revolution, the people are the people who support the building of socialism, and the enemies of the people are the people who resist the building of socialism. And so whatever the government needs, whatever you're supposed to comply with, fighting the Japanese, fighting the nationalists, building socialism, defeating the pandemic, whatever it is the government needs, The people who go along with it, who comply with the orders of the tyrants, are the people who have souls and get treated sort of like humans. And the people who resist are enemies to be eliminated, destroyed, and otherwise used as scapegoats to scare the crap out of everybody else into complying. The way that this works is through a technique that I refer to as Hatecraft, the manufacture of hate. I'm reading the history of Mao's rule in China. I've read the theory, and now I'm reading the actual history of it. And I'm struck reading this. I came away reading one of these books by Frank Dickhotter explaining the history, and I said, wow, you know, I've always known communism is horrible. In fact, I think it's on balance worse than Nazism, but it's very clear that it's worse than Nazism. And you say, how could you say that, James? The Nazis are the pinnacle of horrors. And the truth is that they are very bad. They are, in fact, likely to be the second pinnacle of horrors, the slightly lower peak between the two. But the fact is that with the Nazis, they had very clearly defined enemy groups, and the population was meant to hate those enemy groups and then exterminate those enemy groups, scapegoat those enemy groups, the Jews, racial minorities, the mentally deficient, and so on. And on the other hand, in the Chinese Communist Party, they made everybody hate everybody. Everybody hated everybody. This hatecraft was extremely effective. There are a few ingredients. One ingredient of hatecraft is that you separate the population into these two groups, and then what you do is you promise the population the moon. We're going to get out of the pandemic. We're going to reopen the economy. Your kids are going to go back to school. Those are contemporary examples. We'll have a post-racial, racially just, socially just, whatever world. We'll have a sustainable and inclusive politics or world. We'll have a whole new value system. We're going to avoid climate change. You promised the moon. Or simply, we're going to have bread and land for everybody, as the Soviets promised, or grain and land for everybody, as the Chinese promised. You promise them the moon, and of course it's not going to work. Communism never works. Communists can't manage, they can only conquer. They have no capacity to build, they only have the capacity to destroy and to steal. And so it never works, but what you do is you set it up and say, it will work when enough people are doing it. And some people comply out of fear or out of ideological vision or out of hope. They think finally a better world is coming. They buy in and they sacrifice to make it happen, but some people aren't, and it's not happening. So then you turn their frustration into hate for the people who aren't doing it. That's hatecraft. See, we could have got out of COVID-19 so much sooner. I think Joe Biden even told us that it was a pandemic of the unvaccinated if we just did what we were told. That's the politics of compliance. Another ingredient they used is called speak bitterness in the original Chinese. Speak bitterness. So what the communists would do, and I want you to think very clearly about things like DEI training at work, or the equivalents in the schools, we don't have to get into the details. What they would do is they would come to a village or a county or a province, and they would gather people, the cadres would gather together and force everybody to come to meetings, basically every night, almost every night. They'd bring them out, and at first they would interview everybody they could talk to. And they would find out every bit of biographical information they could extract from them. They don't have to interview us, they have social media now. They would find out all about you, all about everybody, and then after a few weeks, which is about how long it took to catalog everything, everybody still has to come to all the meetings, they would start to encourage people to speak up about all the bitterness they held about other members of their community. So it was very hierarchical. They would have 5 or 6 different categories, rich peasant, middle peasant, poor peasant, and so on. They would get these people to set against each other. You stole my donkey. You never paid me that one debt. You ran off with my daughter. Whatever it happened to be, any grievance they could find or think of, especially if it had political relevance, and if it went up the chain of privilege, they encouraged the rampant speaking of bitterness. And what they found was that the populations were very resistant to doing this, but within a few weeks, they would start to give in. People would start to confess to things that they did, and other people would start to accuse people of other things. And it would start to spiral out of control. And as a matter of fact, the Chinese Communist Party in most places, in most provinces across China through the early 1950s, lost control of this process, and people just started murdering each other. They would round each other up over all of these past wounds and sores that the communists were driving them to accuse each other of, and the more vigorously they would persecute somebody above them on the chain, the more eagerly they would do that, the more the communists would reward them, and you would have massive, massive civil unrest, like I said, murders, people accusing each other, turning each other in. The communists couldn't even control it and would often have to initiate killing campaigns to stop the killing, because only the threat of death would calm the people down enough. Death from the communists would calm them down enough to keep them from killing their neighbors. That's the power of this hatecraft. Now, this is where cultural Marxism comes in our story. There's not just with the pandemic, there's not just with calling Trump supporters deplorables, so in the kind of regular political realm, not just within the public health realm, not just within the climate change, you don't recycle, so you're a bad person. You're not green enough, so we're going to go, I guess, throw paint on the Mona Lisa and on the Stonehenge and sit in a road until nobody can get to work or the hospital. It's not just those domains, but the identity politics was a very specific invention, or not really, he borrowed it from Stalin, but Mao really elaborated the identity politics aspect that then got imported into our intersectional, as they call it, identity politics model here in the West. And what that was about was finding more lines of division across which you could get people to speak bitterness. In the West, we realized that you're never going to get that really across economic lines. We can't even bother, even the most left of us, can't even bother to get that mad about billionaires, because we all in the back of our head believe that if our system's working the way it should, we all have the ability to work hard, get our stuff together, maybe get lucky and climb the ladder, and maybe climb the ladder all the way. We all kind of have that, but they knew that they could stoke these identity politics divisions in our society, and they've known this since the 1960s. Herbert Marcuse, rampant Maoist, leading cultural Marxist of their Western Marxist, critical Marxist, we use whichever words the left doesn't like when you call them cultural Marxists, that's a conspiracy theory apparently, whatever word you want to use, of the 1960s, explicitly said that in the United States and across the West we would need a new proletariat other than the working class. We would need a new working class, he actually called them sometimes, and he said it would be found by combining the radicalizable students with the racial minorities, sexual minorities, feminists, outsiders, mentally ill, and creating a broad activist coalition. And the outcome of that 20, 30 years later was what we call intersectionality. And it's a direct import of Mao's identity politics, where Mao separated the population into a variety of identity groups, and each of those identity groups was basically set at war with the others. The people were coded red for communism, the enemies of the people were coded black, and then each one of those was broken down into a further subdivision. On the red side, the good guys' side from the communist perspective, you have what I call tokens and revolutionaries. It's in the name of the laborers and the peasants. Those are tokens. Like we do things in the name of the racial minorities and the sexual minorities and the gender minorities and the blah, blah, blah minorities. And sometimes, and not so often anymore, women. Those are tokens. There's no evidence whatsoever that the communists have ever cared about a single peasant or ever cared about a single laborer, or in our day, that the woke have ever cared about a single black person they can't control, a single gay person they can't control, a single woman they can't control. These are tokens. They are props. They are excuses. But then there are revolutionary classes, revolutionary leaders and cadres and soldiers, revolutionary intellectuals eventually, revolutionary martyrs. That's who Mao held up. We hold up radical queer activists, allies, other radical activists, community organizers, very revolutionary parties. So you split the red into two groups. On the other side, you take the black categories, and they split into two groups, what I call scapegoats and demons. And that's following Mao's language, where he said, sweep away all monsters and demons. So the scapegoats are the people that are allegedly being targeted. For him, it was rich farmers and landlords. For us, it's whites, straights, men. the wealthy to some degree. And then you have the demons, counter-revolutionaries, bad elements, right-wingers. Those were Mao's. Well, we still got right-wingers and counter-revolutionaries, but we also, instead of bad element or bad influence, we have conspiracy theorist. We have climate denier. We have anti-masker. We have deplorables, racists, transphobes, homophobes. Not real racists, homophobes, or whatever. Not real ones. Ones that are cooked up through weird rules that the left has created that no one recognizes except them. And the goal is to use the evils of the demon class as an excuse to attack the scapegoats. And the goal is to pressure both them and also to pressure those people that are in the token class to become revolutionaries. So they create this massive identity politics pressure on everybody in society who's not already a revolutionary to become a revolutionary by associating them with the characters I call demons and crushing them ruthlessly. What Mao said is that there would be freedom with responsibility, of course, with socialist discipline, but there would be freedom for the people, but for the enemies of the people, there would be the dictatorship of the proletariat. So you crush the enemy class in order to pressure people to join the revolutionary class, which is your only escape hatch. As Sun Tzu said way back in the day, you don't surround your enemy on 4 sides, you surround him on 3, and when they take the path offered to them, because they won't fight to the death if they're only on 3 sides, when they take the path offered to them, destroy them. And so you funnel them into revolutionary classes that do your will, and then in the next wave of the revolution, you purge them. That's the plan. That's how the Maoist system actually worked, and it's extraordinarily effective, and I've just given you, I think, enough information to convince you that in each domain that we're now stressed out about, whether it's this climate BS, whether it's politics writ large, whether it's identity politics, whether it's public health, we could go on, they're using exactly that same set of techniques, the politics of compliance, to extract compliance from the people, and they're very successful at it. Now, the mechanism by which they're doing this in particular is not, it does derive very closely from Mao's methods from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, but it much more immediately derives from George Soros, who I mentioned already is at odds with them, but that doesn't mean they can't steal his method. In the 1980s, George Soros came up with a method of investment manipulation that he was very, very successful with, became very wealthy with, destroyed the British currency with, destroyed other things with, called reflexivity. And if you don't know this word, it's time for you to get used to it. Reflexive political warfare is one of the most common things that we are subjected to that we don't know we're being subjected to, and it works like crazy. The word on the street that you probably use for it is psyops. This is the mechanism of the psychological operation that they use writ large through their big propaganda. So George Soros, I'll tell you about the technique in a second, but I want to put the fine point on it. George Soros very proudly, he brags about this in his book, Alchemy of Finance, took his reflexive method to the PRC, to the Chinese Communist Party, in the 1980s, showed them how it worked, discussed with them how it worked, and they loved it. They loved it. They worked with him under Deng Xiaoping, who succeeded Mao. They adopted it. They took it on as their preferred method of engagement because it was, to put it in the ugly technical terminology, a dialectical method that allowed them to supersede the limitations of traditional Marxist dialectics. So George Soros invented a way of being Marxist that gets you out of the limitations of Marxism. And the CCP identified it for what it was under Deng Xiaoping and adopted it as their tool. It's also the tool that's used by the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, and of course, George Soros and his Open Society Foundation directly. And here's how it works. Reflexivity, he says, the difference between science and social science is a matter of people's involvement. If we're doing a physics experiment, we know we're going to go build a catapult like it's college again, and we're going to launch a soccer ball across the field. We could calculate exactly where the thing's going to land based on the forces, and that's like the homework assignment. He says there's no alchemy hidden anywhere in the physical sciences. It doesn't work. But, and remember his book's called The Alchemy of Finance, there is alchemy in the social sciences because people are interactive. In other words, what he says is you can take the distance between reality and what people believe and manipulate that distance to get outcomes that you desire. So what you do is you lie to people in productive ways. The paradigm example is a bank run. A reflexive statement is a statement that becomes true or false depending on if people believe it or not. So a bank run. Hey, did you know that the bank is going to fail? Better get your money out. Hey, did you know that the bank is going to fail? Better get your money out. You get enough people to believe that, and guess what? They'll go get their money out, and then the bank will fail. That's reflexivity in action. Same thing. Did you know that such and such stock is going to crash? Well, if you could do that with the stock crashing, you could adopt a short sell position before the stock crashes and make a ton of profit off of it, couldn't you, George Soros? You could become one of the world's most influential billionaires that way, couldn't you, George? And that's how he did it. It's not legal for him to start doing the whispers and the rumors, but what you can do is pay a bunch of journalists to focus on particular topics. Let me give you a contemporary example, because there's a reflexive attack I want you to recognize against the Boeing Corporation. I'm not letting Boeing off the hook, but you might want to take a giant, not you personally, somebody like Soros, for example, might want to take a gigantic short sell position against Boeing stock knowing it's about to lose a lot of value because you would win a lot of money. You might be able to get that to come true if, say, you started paying journalists to report on every safety issue that arises with Boeing ever. Oh, a cracked windshield. Oh, a seat that didn't work. Whatever it is. Every major, every minor, every concern, and you build up a social mythology, a perception that Boeing is unsafe, and then Boeing stock eventually topples and crashes following some event that people see as the last straw because they already believe that Boeing's on the way down. George Soros brags in The Alchemy of Finance that he's always taken a certain malicious pleasure in short-selling institutional favorites. Well, let me explain to you an institutional favorite in this world. The United States of America. So how would you short sell the United States? Short selling happens when a company is overvalued against its real value. So you have to make the real value of the United States much lower than its believed value, its perceived value. That difference is world-changing, he says. That's a historical changing circumstance. Well, what you would do is you would fund education that teaches children to hate their country, that it isn't all that good. You would fund immigration that actually strains the system through the Cloward-Piven strategy. You would fund crime or situations that let crime arise so that it seems like the country's just falling apart. So if you can get people to start to believe the country's falling apart, you can create a difference in perceived value and real value, and you can short an institutional favorite and destroy it from within. I'm not talking about, I don't have time to elaborate, I should say, on how George Soros' methods and the Chinese methods disagree, but the methodology of reflexivity is the same. Tell a bunch of stories that induce chaos and incorrect beliefs that people will act upon in a feedback loop situation. When they chase the feedback loop, George Soros says when they're in that chaotic situation, they will look for any guidepost they can grab onto that tells them where to go. So you create the chaos, and when the chaos or the calamity or the collapse starts, you start planting propaganda that tells them where you want them to go, and they'll go. You've probably heard this summarized in the three-word dialectical phrase, problem, reaction, predetermined solution. That's the method. So I've got a minute and a half left to tell you what you can do about this. And you're here doing it if you're in the room, or probably if you're watching. We need to raise awareness that this is how it works. If we were in a firefight, in a war, in World War III kinetic style, or World War II back in the day, and they're shooting and I'm shooting and everybody's shooting, you better know how to shoot and you better know how to take cover. You really need to know how to take cover and hide from the incoming. Right now, we are being absolutely shelled with political warfare using reflexive techniques, and we don't even know how to tell we're being shot at. When we learn, we can't mount a defense against this, much less an offense later. We can't mount a defense against this until we learn what these political warfare artillery shells look like, what it looks like when one's coming in. Like I saw the faces in this room when I explained what's happening to Boeing in the media. Not to let Boeing off the hook, But the media campaign against Boeing is called a reflexive campaign to undermine Boeing, which is a linchpin of American manufacturing, particularly if we end up in a kinetic war with China. We will need aircraft manufacturing. What we need to do is get educated. It is as if every person, I said it's everybody against everybody. Everybody hates everybody in this unrestricted warfare. We have to learn to recognize techniques like reflexivity. We need to recognize techniques like street theater, posing as protests or uprising, and we need to not be swayed by them, which means we have to understand at the basic level how these manipulations work, and we need to tell our neighbors. Never underestimate the power of you as a normal person. I'll tell you one quick story. I know I'm over time, Karen, I'm sorry. One quick story. My friend Chris Elston in Canada, in Vancouver, Canada. He goes by Billboard Chris online. Billboard Chris has changed the world on the gender medicine issue single-handedly. I don't have to get into his detail. He calls himself Billboard because he wears signs on his chest that say things like, children cannot consent to puberty blockers. He does it to inspire people to have conversations with him in the street, knowing he could have conversations on the hypothesis that we could win this fight one conversation at a time. He's about 30,000 conversations deep now, one at a time that he's had, and he's been extraordinarily effective. The reason I bring this up is I want you to think of who you are and what you do and how much more effect you might have than you have any idea to know. Chris was just a dad. He has 2 daughters. He decided to take up this campaign, but it wasn't like he just wandered in and said, I'm going to go change the world today. What happened was he was out with some other people, and somebody just casually decided to talk about what was going on and mentioned the 2-word phrase that Chris had never heard before, puberty blockers. They're using puberty blockers on kids. Chris had never heard of these. So he went back to his house and he looked up puberty blockers on Google, and he said, wow, they do exactly what they say they do. He was horrified and he got active. So what I'm telling you is, just by speaking up about this, you don't know who you're talking to. 99% of the time, you're talking to just somebody. Maybe nothing comes out of it. Sometimes you're talking to Chris Elston, who hears 2 words and changes the world. Sometimes you're talking to Riley Gaines, who hears a few words and changes the world. Sometimes you're talking to Jordan Peterson, who hears a few words and changes the world. Sometimes you're talking to somebody who ends up, running for office or anything else. So don't doubt your ability when you learn to spot this stuff, to explain to people what's going on, to influence someone who, if it's not you, will be the person who goes on to change the world. So I'm encouraging you all not to despair despite these challenges, that we can learn how the enemy is fighting its war, just like in World War II. We can get in the game late, just like in World War II, and we can clean house, just like in World War II. Thank you very much.